Well, thanks, Jeremy and Emily. I'm really happy to be here today. This is an area that I've worked in for a long time and in many different projects around the Bay, and very interested in how things go forward. One of my things about living shorelines is there's many different kinds of projects that can be living shorelines. I think that's really important, and it's all about specific to the place and what the issues are and what the needs are. And so when I talk about Sears Point here, I'm going to go over about why something was needed here and what specifically was done for this place, and to acknowledge that other places have different issues and needs. And so there's great ideas here. Many, if not all, are transferable, but not transferable to every place and every situation. So I think that's really, there's a lot of ideas that could be these living shoreline projects. I want to acknowledge a lot of partners here at the outset. So this is a Sonoma Land Trust project at Sears Point. It's now part of the San Pablo Bay National Wildlife Refuge after they completed the work. The designers in this project were myself, Peter Bay, Roger Leventhal, and Dan Gillenwater that did all the design and construction work. We were very, very fortunate through my role at San Francisco State University and at the National Research Reserve. We had a graduate student, Becca Morris, who made the outcomes of this project her master's thesis, which she is filing today. So very excited that she's at that point. And so I'll be having some of her data presenting as well. And we want to acknowledge that the level of insight we have from this is really increased because she made this her master's thesis, and that's often not the case on projects. Now to advance the slides. There we go. So a couple slides quick on location and context. So Sears Point is up in San Pablo Bay. It's a little bit shy of 1,000-acre tidal marsh restoration project that was opened up in 2015, as I mentioned, by Sonoma Land Trust, now part of the refuge. And so what we're doing here is a project that is adaptive management repair to a component of the project that didn't work out as intended. And so I'll get a little bit as to why and then what we've done to address that. And then the reason it's really important here, so Sears Point restoration in the middle here, I'll outline in black. This is the almost 1,000 acres. There's two things I want to really point out here besides these adjoining restoration projects. One is this blue line, which are the flood protection levees. That's what keeps all the diked baylands behind them dry. And so that includes State Route 37, a whole lot of private property up the east side of the Petaluma River, on this other side of the hill to go over towards Tole Creek. And keeping those areas dry, those landowners in the state with the highway depend upon these externally owned levees to be intact, functioning, and maintained. And so when Sears Point was restored in 2015, the old levee was down the bay shore, and now it's this new levee in the back. And so it has to perform as well as other levees. Otherwise, you flood a whole lot of important infrastructure. And so that's part of the driver why I want to make sure that this really works well. So I'll give a little sense of what got built to the original project and why we came in here. And so there was this tidal flood control levee along the north, and that was the levee setback project, a component of the project in essence from what was the Bayfront levee initially. And that's part of the area we're working on quite a bit. There's a levee on the west that separates this site from the Sonoma Baylands restoration to the west. And it's in some ways, it's just an upland feature between two restoration projects. However, it's also dedicated public access, so it needs to be maintained. Down the southwestern side, they put some dredge material in an area when they dredged from the levee breach out to the deep water of the Petaluma River to make sure we had good tidal exchange. That dredge material was put in some containment cells on the inside. And then all these little black dots you see everywhere, those are marsh mounds. People are looking at these in various places, and there's about 500. And the idea there is between these marsh mounds and the gentle slope of the habitat levee, that the marsh mounds would be a wave dissipation feature, and the gentle levee would be a wave dissipation feature as well. And so those were intended to be the mechanism by which you would not have shoreline erosion and be able to really promote these things, as well as those mounds also would be early points of marsh establishment. So rather than having a bathtub ring only of marsh development, you'd also have these 500 points of organic marsh development in the interior. And this site was about mean low water, very roughly at point in time of construction, and is relied upon natural sedimentation to raise elevations. So you have this time lag between breach and accretion to reach vegetated marsh elevation for plants to begin to come in. And then we also have these levee pans on the North Habitat levee, these little green spots, which I'll get into a little bit. I won't talk about too much today. So the reason we did this adaptive management project is that the original design that we did 15 years ago, the idea was that you would not breach until you had vegetated those marsh mounds and the levee slopes in the interior, even if it's sacrificial vegetation. And so you use the biological as well as the physical pieces to make that system work. But that wasn't done, and it was breached at the end of earthwork. And so one lesson learned is include your biological design features in your projects, not just the physical earthwork features. And so as a consequence, there's two main consequences happened. You can see in the top two pictures, that's the northern levee, that it went from a nice gentle slope 10 to 20 to 1 to have pretty severe erosion scarps. And what kept happening is marsh plants would come in and then they would get scoured away. The marsh wasn't forming. Every year it would just get wiped out. And we're cutting, we cut about 150 feet back into that levee. The habitat levee slope, not to the core, but to the habitat levee slope. And on the bottom of the western levee to some Baylands, same kind of thing, was it cut deeply into that levee, and it got pretty close to the levee crest in a few of those places, and it affected public access, dedicated space, but it wouldn't have had as much of an effect ecologically necessarily. The other part that we're not talking about here today is all those 500 marsh mounds, the tops got lopped off within the first year or two, and another student at SF State, Margot Bookbinder, did her master's thesis on the demise and the efforts to try to remedy and rescue all those marsh mounds. And so really, when we got to this next phase, so what we're doing here is repairing an eroding shoreline and setting it up so that it doesn't keep eroding, and so that the marsh that's forming the edge can actually form and establish, not get wiped out constantly. And so the idea is to use nature-based strategies to do that, compatible with the ecological objectives of the restoration project, and avoid the need to come in and do levee armoring and rock riprap, anything of that sort. And the intended outcomes, in essence, were to either halt or minimize any ongoing erosion, and to get that marsh really establishing along the toe of that levee, and as accretion happened, help it spread out into the broader restoration site. So what I'm going to talk about are the 9 discrete and interrelated elements of this restoration design. And so the key thing here is we have a lot of pieces, they work together. So you can maybe do with less or not, but the idea is it's not one thing solved all your problems. It was the package together that really did the trick. So I'm going to go over what those 9 things are. It was a treatment along a little bit shy of 2 miles of levee, mostly that northern flood control levee, and some on the levee that separates the Sonoma Baylands project. And I'll kind of talk about each of these pieces one by one. So the obvious one is to regrade the scarps so that we don't have that abrupt edge, because one thing that these vertical scarps do, if waves hit them, you get wave reflection and it scours back down below. So trying to halt that process. And so there was a pretty straightforward regrading. We had about a little bit over half of the levee required regrading to get these slopes back. We lose some of that 10 to 1 to 20 to 1 because that dirt has now been moved out in the middle of the marsh. So you get a little bit steeper slopes, but at least you get the levee back there. And so traditional earthwork to do that is a picture of Peter Bay in the top left walking along before we got a sense before we did the grading, to get a sense of the roughly 3-foot tall scarp where he was standing there. Next, this is one of the pieces we did. It was we put in about 240 logs, large logs along the shoreline here. And on the top left picture is a log that floated in all by itself to the restoration project at some point along the way and settled out on the shoreline. They tend to come in and they get pushed up, and they become these shadows. They create shadows where sediment can build up and marsh plants can establish. So we had a very on-site demonstration of how logs could work really well here. And so we use that site-specific guidance to say, well, let's see if we could put lots of logs in. And we did, and we put 240 logs in. You can see that truck hauling them in, big pieces of logs, 2 to 4 foot diameter for the most part, about 20-foot sections. And they had to get put in at an angle, think about which way the wind is moving and the currents. and then they ought to get anchored down. And one thing I'll say about this project is every material used is a recycled, reused local material from something else. The only thing that we had to buy that wasn't that were the cables and anchors to hold logs in place. That came from online or from a supplier. Everything else, all the logs here were either from utility line clearing from PG&E or fire resilience clearing. So all these logs. We also learned eucalyptus are great because they're negatively buoyant. Most of the logs want to float and are a problem. So we had a mix, and eucalyptus is definitely the way to go. They're much easier to make stay put. The next thing we did also was we placed almost 5,000 cubic yards of dried granular bay mud. And so we went over to the Port Sonoma Marina, which is right nearby, and they haven't dredged for a long time, but they dredged in the past, and they have these what were dredged ponds are now just basins of dry dredge material. And we took 5,000 yards out of there, hauled it over, and shook it up a little bit, break it into small pieces. You can see the picture on the left, the handful there. It's kind of like micro gravel, but it will crumble once you start putting it into place. And we put it on the bay side of every single log, and a few other places sprinkled it in. The contractor was really good. You can see in the picture in the upper left that we sprinkled it where there was already cordgrass growing, and you could shake it in there to fill around, not lose any cordgrass. And that was about 80% of the levee got this treatment here. And the idea is that mud does two things. One, tides move it around, so it's mobile sediment supply that the tides move it, and it gets behind those logs and helps build, and a really good substrate for plants to colonize. And it also raises elevations below those logs and helps bring things up to be more suitable elevation for plants to colonize directly there. The next thing we did, the eastern end had a little more wind wave exposure for a few reasons, and so we did a few extra treatments there to really help make things work. So the first thing that we did was we had areas where we're concerned about ongoing erosion, so we placed some larger gravel below the logs, so we could really get that to make sure that if we did have that mud moved away, we had something below that kept things in place so plants could get growing. And so that was about 3-inch gravel we put out there, and then that got buried by bay mud. And so that happened, and things are divided by cells. I mentioned those pans, that kind of created a mixture of headlands and cells on the whole shoreline there. And so we divided things into these cells for practical purposes. And so the gravel came from some flood control channel dredging up in Sonoma County. Pretty much all the gravel of the different sizes came from those kinds of projects. And so that was also a very important piece of the equation here. In those same areas, we built brush fences offshore, and they are just coyote brush harvested on site. There's a lot of coyote brush grows out there. So that was easy to harvest that. And then we had hand crews would take the brush of coyote and 2 rows of brush fence along those 2 cells a little bit offshore to help dampen the wave energy a little bit and protect that shoreline a bit extra from the rest of it. And so that got about 15%. You got those features there. And then we this is interesting, it's called adaptively managing during construction, we were in construction in fall of 2021, and we started on the east end and we're working our way west. And we were putting above the logs a veneer of like 3-inch minus gravel mixed with sand. And we put it there because we're really concerned about erosion at that end. And we had a huge storm roll through during construction. And one of the things that we saw in that storm is things performed beautifully. Everything stayed put. We're like, okay, maybe we hadn't planned to put that gravel veneer everywhere, but we saw how effective it worked during construction. And so we modified and added that gravel veneer across a lot more of the levee to really add that erosion protection benefit and that habitat development benefit. The gravel veneer and then these gravel toe berms, they are providing substrate for plants to establish this kind of sort of a coarse gravel beach concept where plants can establish there. And those are tend to be very mobile sediments, and they've worked very well to hold things in place and help develop the ecosystem there. And then these gravel toe berms, you can kind of see in these pictures, they're just piles of gravel. Again, 3-inch minus mixed with sand and pea gravel. And the idea is that you put it down there in the higher tides and then storms work it around and move it around. And you can see in the left, it's piled a nice triangular mound. A few days later, the top of that mound was already flattened down by some high tides. So very rapid reworking of the tides there to really help create that natural beach at the site here. And that was a bit over than half of the levee got this treatment. Doesn't take a lot. We used 675 cubic yards of this material, so not a lot to really make this whole thing work. And then the other piece is offshore. We actually began 2 years before construction planting cordgrass. And so this was a little bit further offshore and out in front of all the planned work area. And you can see in this map in the green, that's where all the cordgrass planting took place over the course of 3 planting seasons. Again, this material came on site because we know I have issues with invasive spartina. We worked with the invasive spartina project. We did genetic testing to make sure that what we were using was native cordgrass, not invasive cordgrass. So really important to make sure we don't create a new problem on our hands here. And so you can see these little tiny plugs that got planted along here, all up and down the shoreline, and some survived, some didn't, and then a lot of it got kind of merged in with a lot of natural colonization there. So let's think about what this got us, right? So I really emphasize those are all the things that we did, and other places, this could be a great solution for certain kind of settings, but you don't need to do this everywhere for everything. The place where I think this works well is these areas that aren't yet vegetated, have a lot of open water, have wind fetch. You have an edge that has the risk of eroding. I think we've many projects have experienced this over the years, and really whether you need to do it depends upon is what you want that edge to do for you. Do you want ecology out of it? Is it providing a flood protection benefit of some sort? Do you need to go through doing this kind of thing or not? So there's the need for feasibility basis design all play into these things. So really, in many ways, we had 3 metrics of outcomes. So the first one is that we actually got marsh forming, and it was persistent. It was actually working, and the current status is we have a lot of establishment, and it seems to be holding so far. You know, we're 3 years out now, so you never know for sure, but so far a lot of marsh, and it's holding itself in place really well. The second one is that those the regraded ecotone levee slopes stay put. We have no erosion or very little, and this was the target. And what we're finding is almost no erosion whatsoever. We have a few spots where it's a little bit eroding, not vertical, you know, half a foot to a foot. It dropped back at like 45-degree angle. So there's a little bit, but not very much. And the third one was that we actually had that restoration side of the bay toe of that levee accreting and the marsh really moving outward. And what's interesting here is that had the interior of the site accreted very rapidly, and we're working separately on monitoring the accretion of the restoration. The faster that comes up, that protects the shoreline as well. But we had to do this project because we weren't there yet. The marsh hadn't proceeded fast enough. We're very close now to that place where the accretion in the marsh, plus all the work on vegetating those 500 marsh mounds, plus what's happening on the edge, we're starting to really get marsh formation. And it's really pushing outward now, away from the bathtub ring, out more into the middle, which is fantastic. So I'll show you a few slides of things that we've learned from monitoring. A big chunk of this came from Becca Morris's work for her master's thesis. So a few pictures first. We have a lot of fixed photo monitoring points, a ton. And so this is one of them from pre-construction and late summer 2021 till a couple months ago. So there's a picture in the upper left of maybe me standing there against an eroded edge. In early 22, shortly after the work was done, you can see that gravel toe berm and veneers already spread itself out. You can see the logs in that picture. You can see the brush fence off in the distance. Not a lot of vegetation yet. By the end of that growing season, you can already see a bunch of vegetation beginning to come in, a lot of pickleweed, a little bit of cordgrass coming in down low. Brush fence is still intact. The lower left picture in November of 2023, a lot more pickleweed growing. They've got some more mixed transition vegetation, a little higher elevation. You can see the cordgrass has really come in a lot. You can still see the logs there. And then just a couple months ago, quite a bit of vegetation. Maybe not, that hasn't expanded a huge amount this past year, but some. And it's persisting, which is really the important thing we want to see there. So really coming across nicely. And this map on the right kind of gives you a sense of where this particular set of photos is taken. And we've got a few dozen of these kinds of sets to really see visually how things are working over time. So this is showing visually we're going where we want to go, which is really fantastic. And this, the more eastern, and this is area that was having more severe erosion, and we gave extra treatments to make sure it really held in place.
Stuart, these photos are amazing. Maybe one more minute and then if you can wrap it up.
Sure. Yep.
Thank
Okay. So I'll talk about the vegetation pieces here. This is Becca's work, really seeing how the vegetation really began to establish, really rapid establishment of vegetation. In the first year, if you look at the percent increase in vegetation, 100 to 166% increase in area of vegetation in the treatment areas. And you can see in these GIS maps, especially at the top, these mostly barren areas were very vegetated after just 2 years. So really rapid, very rapid colonization. And the only planting done here was those rows of cordgrass. All the rest is natural colonization. And then if you kind of take this from a different angle and say the density of vegetation across the whole shoreline, you can see in the top, right when we finish construction, some upland vegetation, some patches of vegetation that was already there. This darker, the green was in place already. And then by August of 2023, very high density across the entire shoreline. So really significant expansion and formation of marsh there that is still holding in place very nicely. We wanted to make sure that the shoreline didn't have erosion. So we have lots of topographic transects, a couple of them. The bottom one I like, these little, is that we regraded the scarp, the bay mud, you can kind of see down to the bottom, this little hump, and it's been moved around a fair bit. So the black line is where we built it, and then it's been getting moved around over time, which is the way it was supposed to work, is that mud was physically distributed by the tides in a bunch of places, which is really great to see. And then the other part was we're trying to really push out into the bay.
Sorry? Merry Christmas. Not there yet, though.
So you kind of see that these are digital terrain modeling here. If you look at any one of these cells, you can look, the purple is low, and you kind of pick a cell and see a lot of it's pretty low, a lot more elevation gain there. And this is the mud, not the plants. So you can really see it's really promoted accretion through natural depositional processes to really help raise elevation. And that's been really help allow vegetation to push itself out further out into the restoration site. And that is it. So perfect timing, Emily. Thank you.